Okay, I see the red thing, so we must be recording.
We're doing the thing.
So we were talking a little bit before you came on, and I
So
just
tell me
was
about the probe.
yeah. So we we sent I think it was like a couple years ago we sent a probe to go to an asteroid called Bennu, Bennu.
Is this the one that
And
landed on and did an actual touchdown, grabbed the sample, and comes back? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, really, and the video is really cool. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's
that
fascinating because we never knew that asteroids had their own little gravity pull. Like it's a very small one, but it was enough for the lander to stay on it.
Yeah, and they came back with all this material. In fact, they got so much material that they had a hard time closing the container.
When did
And
it come back? Because I haven't heard news of this.
yeah, so it landed, and I think it was in 2024 that it landed. I'm just going off the top because I read the article earlier today. But but the thing that I thought that this article was talking about that's really interesting is when they analyzed the samples, they found the the trace chemicals that are required to to create DNA. Um, so there's long been a theory that that life on Earth was um, was was created by first it was traveling through space. And there's really two theories for that traveling through space. One theory is that matter can be transmitted by radio waves. So the material that is required to create life as we know it could have been transmitted by radio waves that are created by a collapsing sun. There's all kinds of things that could create it, and then that matter traveled through Earth or traveled through interstellar space at the speed of light. And anytime it runs into something, it leaves those traces behind. So that's one theory. And then the other theory has been that, oh, well, maybe the building blocks of human life traveled here on an asteroid. And then the asteroid slammed into the planet. And that's how life started on Earth. And uh, this discovery gives credibility to that second argument because what we found on that asteroid wasn't life, but all of the chemicals that are necessary in order
It's
for plants to produce life are on the asteroid.
it's the ingredients of the primordial soup, as it were.
Yeah, yeah, and that's I don't know if you read it, but I somewhere I got it around my copy. But there's a book by Sarah Walker
Yeah,
called
the life as no one knows it.
Yeah,
Yeah, you it's recommended that to me last year, and I listened to the audiobook, and it was a fantastic listen. There's a lot of concepts in there that, touch on, trying to build a bridge between what science can explain and what religion can't explain, and where did all these things come from. Is really, really fascinating. And she gives, I remember one of the things that you had said is you felt like she didn't give herself enough credit, and that she gave so much credit to so many other people. And I didn't feel like that when I listened to it. I felt like the first half of the book, she really she showed a lot of respect for the people that helped her get into the position that she was at the university. But then when you get to the second half of the book and you listen to the things that she's been doing, like she is doing some amazing work.
yeah, she is a really I think she's one of the smartest people on the planet, and she's working in a field, theoretical physics, which is I mean it's how not only how things are, but how they might be, which is a huge question, and I think it's a very interesting prospect.
Well, and I think that that's one of the it's an interesting question that nobody really knows how to do the dance around of like, oh, what is it that you think of that is everything after this, like we get this really cool, hopefully around 80 to 90 years where we have the senses that we have. But once that's all stripped away and its energy, what is the next thing? Where did all of this come from? What came before? And everybody has a different theory on it, and everyone kind of thinks that they're right. And this is one of the things that I always find fascinating about when you told me that you were um, going into Catholicism, and especially at the age that you're at, because you don't really hear a lot of people that go from there was kind of the born again time frame that we had in the 90s. There was the non-denominational in the early 2000s. You had a very humanist, there was a very angry period, and then to circle back and get to Catholicism, I'm just really curious of all of the ways that you've had your thought process work. What do you think of when you think of the things that come after this? Like, what is that to you?
Yeah, so I've got a like a personal view. So it's my personal theology, and I call it Galilean theology. And Galileo Galilei was a famous astronomer, invented the telescope. He was a polymath, came up with all kinds of theories, um, and he wrote a book that um, um, was advancing a theory by another astronomer by the name of Copernicus. And the theory that he advanced was that the Copernican theory was that the sun and all the astral bodies didn't rotate around the Earth, that the Earth was an astral body and we were rotating around the sun. Now, when I say that today, everybody's like, "Well, of course, well, everybody knows that all the planets rotate around the sun." But prior to Copernicus, the 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 understanding was that the Earth was a static place and it never moved, and everything else revolved around the Earth. And the Catholic Church did not like that theory at all, and and they called Galileo, who was a Catholic. They called Galileo to task, and they said, "Hey, you've gotta recant all these writings. You can't do this anymore."
Well, didn't they
And
accuse him of apostasy?
yeah, so he ended up in prison for life. The church put him in prison for life. And it wasn't that bad of a prison. I mean, he was at home imprisonment.
It was a nice prison.
Nice prison. Yeah, but and he wasn't allowed to publish any more works. And if you think about that, um, I mean, if you just look at just uh, do an AI search on Galileo, and you'll find out that I mean, he's a really, really fantastic guy, and to not be able to publish, uh, what he was researching was not only a horrible thing for him, but it's a horrible thing for the world. The world was, uh, and so anyway, so he wrote the book, and that was one of the things that the church was mad at. But the other thing that the church was mad at him about was he wrote a letter to an aristocrat, a wealthy, a powerful landowner lady, and he was what he was doing is he was saying he was looking for money for research. He was trying to he was writing a grant like researchers do now. So he was trying to get money for research, and he said, we really need to set things up so that scientists can do all of their work independent of theology, so independent of the church. And whatever the discoveries are, the scientists need to be able to publish um, those discoveries without having to worry about getting them cleared by the church. Which again, today we're like, well, of course, science is completely independent. But that didn't stand, and that was between those two charges, he was charged for those two things. One for heresy for writing the book, and then the other um, for heresy for saying that the church wasn't in charge of everything, and they put him in prison for life. So my point with the whole Galilean theology is when you look at science and you look at scientific discoveries, you have to have from a theology perspective, you've got to have a view of God that is large enough that no matter what is discovered, God is part of that. And isn't just part of it, but God is beyond that. He's greater than that. So like if all of a sudden we find aliens and you're like, oh man, well, if there's life on another planet, then my faith is going to just crumble. Then you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to try and deny the science, or your faith is going to crumble. So
Or
yeah,
if you're a Mormon and you're like celestial kingdoms, right? I'm getting spirit babies. I'm going to those planets. I had that conversation a couple months ago with one of my Mormon clients and had no idea how much he was entirely on board with aliens. And I was like, I guess that does make sense for you.
yeah, and for more Orthodox Christians, um, I recently read a book called Five Views of Adam and Eve. They're called perspective books, where a theologian with a particular perspective on an issue writes a paper defending their perspective, and you get five of those people together, so they each write a perspective of whatever that is. In this case, it was Adam and Eve. What is that narrative? Um, and then each of the other four critique that person's writing. So every chapter is, here's a view, and then there's four people who criticize that view, and then you go, here's another view, here's four people that criticize that view.
Okay.
So I was again, there's um Adam and Eve for Christianity are huge. I mean, it's a huge thing, but and not just, oh man, it had to be in a garden and it had to be this, that, or the other thing, but because of the concept of original sin. And in the Christian perspective, everyone is a sinner, not because they've done anything bad, but because the seed of humanity, we are uh, you know we are inheritors of this rebellious spirit. And because that original sin came into the world, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you are a human being on the earth, then you are in need of salvation, not just because of what you did, but because of this concept of original sin. So then you're like, oh, okay, well, that concept came from the creation narrative, chapter 3 of Genesis, where Eve eats the fruit, gets convinced by the snake. Adam then eats the fruit. God gets mad, banishes him from the garden, and that's how original sin comes in. Well, that works if you say, yeah, the that creation narrative, that story of Adam and Eve is a factual story, that those were two real people in a real garden at a real time in a real place. But if you're like, oh, okay, well, hang on a second, Eve is kind of a metaphoric name for the beginning, and Adam is a metaphoric name. The word Adam, the very same word in Hebrew, is mankind. So so it's a very figurative story, to where Adam is actually mankind and Eve is the beginning. So the story of Adam and Eve is a figurative story of the beginning of mankind.
See, and that's a perspective that I can understand a little bit more than when we were, I feel like growing up going to North Georgia Southern Baptists. It was a very literal, there is fire in hell, there is brimstone waiting for you if you are a sinner. And it was a very literal interpretation of all of that. And I remember reading, actually, I listened to the audiobook of Stephen Fry's Mythos, and it's the creation stories of all the Greek gods. And he has a trilogy and he narrates all of the audiobooks, and they're fantastic. But one of the things that he really talks about is every story of the origin of Zeus and Kronos and all of the gods are kind of told with a little bit of flair because they're stories and they're not necessarily literal interpretations, but they're there to get the point driven home. They're supposed to make sense to you so that way you can understand the core concepts of them. And last year, one of the books that I read was John Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And it was a really, really interesting read because it kind of redefines the narrative of the Bible as the whole thing is a metaphor for an even older religion that's more than just 2,000 years old, but it's something that goes 8 to 12,000 years back. And because the Romans were persecuting so many different religions at the time, they kind of had to codify this thing. And there's a lot of meaning in the names that go through. And the whole concept of Jesus's love is Jesus is the metaphor to love, and love is the whole experience that we're supposed to be having with one another, because that's the unification. And there's not necessarily specific names to anything, but people need to understand it. So names are put onto things.
Yeah, uh, and to get back to the Catholicism, that's one of the reasons. There's several reasons, but one of the reasons why I'm drawn to Catholicism is the theology is just much richer. And you talked about different aspects, like um, you know, uh, uh, manifestation of like sign gifts, people speaking in tongues and exorcist demons, those kinds of things. That was real when we were in Hawaii and we were going to New Hope, because that was a very Pentecostal um, uh, uh, religion, that denomination was. But but Catholicism has all that stuff. I mean, it is the oldest um, Christian tradition, uh, and um, uh, and so all the mystics and and you know much of the moves of science, Galilean, the whole Galileo thing aside, uh, the the Catholic Church has really been a champion of science. And so anyway, there's that's just one of the reasons why I've been drawn towards it, is the theology is much richer. And uh and I mean, I think one of the things that's important is, like, if you want to try and interpret a story, the first thing you have to do is understand the story that was written. So the creation story, the first three chapters of the Bible, they tell a very specific story of a particular place and particular characters in that place and events that happened within that space by those characters. Um, and uh, once you understand the story, then you kind of set back and you say, okay, well, this story has to fit into the overall narrative of the Bible. There's because if the premise in Christianity is that the Bible is a collection of books, so it's a library. It's a collection of books, and it's unique in that the books have human authors and a divine author. So humans actually wrote the book at a particular place and in a particular time. So you have to know what the human was trying to say. But then God, who is so, again, this gets into the physics of it. There's when when we talk about like the hand of God or the mind of God or the eyes of God, the mouth of God, God doesn't have a hand. He's a spiritual being. So so literally everything in the Bible is figurative when it speaks about God and the character of God, because God is not material. He's not made in our world, but the only way we can communicate those things is by using things that we understand. There's a saying, and it's been attributed to the road manager for the band AC/DC. I don't know if that's true, but that's how I heard it. Uh, and what he said is that um, God is the blanket we throw over the mystery so we know how to describe it. Um, and that's what I think that's a good way to look at religion. Religion is what you throw over on top of this mysterious being of God, because you have to be able to say something. You've got to be able to
See,
explain it somehow.
I I disagree actually. I think that if you're cold, you need a blanket. And that's why I don't have a problem with blankets existing because there are people who feel cold. And for me, again, like raised in the church. So we were Southern Baptist, then we were Pentecostal, non-denominational. There was the Northern Lights Church in Alaska that we went to, and we were supposed to plant the church here. I very much was believing a lot of that until kind of the end of my first marriage. And to be really honest, the thing that got me wondering was when Neil deGrasse Tyson did the Cosmos series on Fox. That was the first time in my life that I had ever got to actually hear what science was, because we had started homeschooling at the end of fifth grade, and it was a Christian-based homeschool academy. So I wasn't really exposed to a science that wasn't a church-approved science. And when that show came out, oh my God, all these concepts came to life, and it it sparked curiosity, and it actually had an effect on me where I realized like there's another explanation of things. And this entire time that I've been in this one um, organization, it's always said, you don't need to look into any of the other things. You just need to have faith in this one. And that was ultimately one of the things that I think ended my marriage was I started really looking at uh, Islam and Mormonism and Satanism and even Scientology at one point. I remember reading Dianetics in the living room and just screaming out, "Oh my God, I can't believe these people believe this." And I realized I couldn't find myself in the church anymore just because I realized that there were so many other alternatives out there. And there was a video that I was exposed to. It's a fantastic lecture. It's called Understanding the 10th Dimension. And understanding the 10th dimension goes back to this thesis that was written in the early 1900s called Flatlanders. And it tries to explain what a one-dimensional being would look like to a two-dimensional being and what a one-dimensional being would look like in a two-dimensional space, and how a two-dimensional being can manipulate two-dimensional space, and how that could make it so that way a one-dimensional being never realizes that they're being manipulated because of their forced perspective. So one of the best examples of it was a Mobius strip. And if you have a top and a bottom of a piece of paper, then it's going to think this is the existence and it'll never know about this. But if you put a twist in it and then you bend it back on itself, now because of this Mobius strip, it can see both sides and it can see all of reality all at once. And we're three-dimensional beings living in a three-dimensional existence, and we experience the fourth dimension of time linearly. And it goes through this entire process of what third dimensional beings in a fourth dimension would look like, what fourth dimensional beings can do to manipulate that area to have a third dimensional being in. And it goes all the way up into this whole concept of what you're talking about with multiverse and theoretical physics of what all the possibilities are. And a fifth dimensional being, a fourth dimensional being, time isn't linear. They can go back and forth in time, but basically they're only going to be able to hit the fast forward and rewind button. They're not going to be able to make any changes, but at the end of your life, you could go back and do your life all over again and experience everything over again. And you can hit fast forward and rewind. If you're a fifth dimensional being, though, you might be able to go back into that time in high school when you really screwed up with that girl you really wanted to make things work out with, and be able to go into that timeline. A sixth dimensional being might even be able to go into that timeline, find experiences, and bring them into a different timeline. So once I got exposed to this video, I started realizing, okay, what are the things that most major religions kind of come together on? Okay, there's an all-powerful being that's omnipotent, omnipresent, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-existing, all-being, basically a seventh dimensional being, based on what the science is telling me here. And we're limiting that to a bunch of different people's definitions of 2,000 pages. And that's where I really have the problem with religion, is I think that it's too limiting. I remember going to there was a time where I was very, very angry with all of it, because I for a very long time just thought, why in the hell would my parents put me through all this stuff? Like, this is ridiculous. I was misguided my entire life, and I really just wanted to go with atheism. And there was a meet an atheist night with the Idaho Atheists Association. And I have never met a more miserable group of fucks in my entire life. And I was trying to make friends with these people, but it's just like, ha ha ha. Remember when we all thought that there was a God? We're dumb. And they're all just like patting themselves on the back and being so assured that there's nothing that happens next. And I'm like, you guys believe the exact same thing that somebody else believes. You just define it like this. You just change one thing, where instead of everlasting happiness, you get like an everlasting nap. Which also sounds kind of nice depending. But I've always thought that everyone has too definitive of a view. And I think science is trying to explain what reality can exist in, and religion is trying to explain those things that you can't explain. And with my experiences, I think it's mysticism. I think it's somewhere in between. I think that everybody is trying to define what they can't define, and that's that whole blanket that you're talking about. But I'm actually more empowered by not knowing. I think that that's the most exciting thing. Is I remember when the Space Force first became a thing, and you had told me how you thought that that was amazing because Elliot might be able to be in a world where there's new discoveries that we have to actually make. We can live in a new world of exploration that we haven't been able to see for generations because the world is largely explored. I think the next thing being a mystery is the most exciting thing about that exploration. We don't know. And trying to define it seems counterproductive to the experience that we're given the gift of having. Um, and having definition seems just kind of like putting guardrails on people, which people need.
Yeah, there's and uh you know there I was just thinking we were talking about the science curriculum that for our homeschooling effort. Um, you know, at that time, I mean, we're talking in the 1990s. I mean, there wasn't a lot of options for homeschool. Everything was faith based. Everything, and it was all uh, Christian based. So, so you had really two choices. You either went with a religious curriculum, or um, you had to do a whole lot of work. So you had to make your own curriculum. You had to, and one of the things that I liked about that is because, like, we would send you and your brother to go to the public school to just take tests. So, so when they were doing their standardized testings, we would drive you to the school, drop you off with four number two pencils, and you would take
We
the
were those kids. I never knew
yeah
it.
you,
I never knew it, but we were those kids.
yeah. There's and but we did that because we wanted to make sure that what we were doing wasn't damaging, that we were actually um, teaching you the things that you needed to know. And you guys always scored very, very well. So and you didn't get the benefit that, like the kids in the public school where they they study for the test for 3 weeks prior to taking the test. You guys just were like, hey, next Tuesday you're going to take a test at this public school, and it was a legitimate test of your functional knowledge, and you still scored in the very upper brackets. So 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 I mean, I think overall it was a pretty good curriculum, but a lot of it was frustrating for me as well, because um, I call it textualism. There's where people are like, oh, okay, I look at the text of the Bible, and whatever that text says, that is the truth. That's the absolute meaning of that. And I think you have to start there. But once you understand what the text says, then you need to be able to use um, uh, something that's a little bit broader to make it more realistic. And that's in the Catholic tradition. That's called sensius plenior, which just means greater meaning. So there is the text of the Bible, but then there's just greater meaning, and that's the tradition of the church. That's the tradition that's been passed down for the last almost 2,000 years.
Okay. So I guess the concern that a lot of people have, and I think that this is really interesting, that we're talking about going into faith-based education, and especially when you see the laws that are changing that are empowering states to be able to bring more of a faith-based curriculum into the public sector. One of the really interesting reasons that I got associated with the Satanic Temple was less in actual theology, but what they were doing in the legal system to be able to make sure that freedom of religion was something that was available to everyone. And this is one of the conversations that I see a lot of my friends having over, the first 10 days of this administration, and seeing how there's a lot of movement of really bringing faith back in America. And I think that growing up in faith, there are some positive aspects of it, but really putting all of your focus on that and knowing that there is a science outside of the church, and then there's a science that is within the church. Is this type of education going to be adequate because people are just looking at a book and taking things potentially out of context, and they're taking things very literally? This is one of the problems that I have when people talk about me and my tattoos, and it's like, okay, you're referring to a verse in Leviticus that's referring to a tribe of people that were marking their skin as kind of a way of celebrating their dead and honoring their dead, and they were being told not to use their skin as altars. That's a very different context than what is going on nowadays, and also that's Old Testament. So really, if you're paying attention to your book and the context of the book, all of that really kind of went away with the New Testament of Jesus. And these are the things that I'm really concerned about with as much religious fervor that there is with this new administration. Is I feel like there could be a lot of movement that's based off of what you're calling textualization.
Yeah, there's. I mean, I would a couple things. One, when you when you look at the the law of the Old Testament. I think what that really um, is it's an example of one of the earliest codes that was written for a nation. So there, when this is manifesting itself still today, in that people call the land of Israel, the land that Israel is on right now, they call it Palestine. Um, and Palestine was occupied by a whole bunch of different tribes, including um, uh, the uh, the Philistines, which the Philistines actually got Anglicized into Palestine. But those people were really just tribes, and they were ruled by the strongest person in the tribe, and it was very, very ad hoc. So they would make a decision. Once they make the decision, everybody had to do whatever the ruler said. Israel was very unique in that they wrote a set of laws, and those laws applied to everybody. Even the king had to obey the laws that were written. And In the narrative, those laws were given to the nation as a gift from God. So, like when you talk about an eye for an eye uh, kind of justice. Well, if you look at the other societies that were that were present at that time, they it wasn't an eye for an eye. It was like, if you poke out one of my people's eyes, I'm going to come in and kill all of you and take your women and all your stuff. So it was very much not an even thing. If somebody offended you, you had to destroy them. Um, that law was limiting uh, on the behaviors of everybody. And so it was, so to me, that's what's interesting about it. It's like, oh, okay, so this society existed. And, like, really, in terms of like the numbers of laws, uh, it's not that big a number. It's less than 700 in the entirety of the Old Testament, less than 700 specific laws. And if you look at like the laws in the United States, goodness gracious. I mean, you want to talk about thousands and that scores of thousands of laws just at the federal level. And then every state has different laws, and then every city has different laws.
Well, I
And
guess I guess you're going in a direction of the types of laws that they had, and I agree with you that it's great that there was an establishment of some kind of democracy of laws that went out to everyone. More of what I'm referring to is kind of the cultural shift of Christianity since the 90s. So we can look at like tattoos, for instance. I remember turning 18 and you guys having conversations with me and Brad specifically about like, hey, you need to know what you're getting into. Like it's not a world that really accepts what you're doing. And we were very fortunate to be kind of riding this wave of acceptance and society kind of changed. But while we were in church, there were plenty of people that scoffed at us and they said that that's, not Christian. You shouldn't do those things. You shouldn't do these things. And they're referring to books of the Bible that are Old Testament scriptures. And there are many things that we learn in the greater context and the greater message that has been kind of changed from the perspective of what I see has happened with Christianity from the 90s to the modern day. The modern day Christianity is much more angry, it seems. It's much more opposing to the sinner. And I don't feel the same kind of love and acceptance that I felt when there was the church that was growing up, that really did want to have love the sinner, hate the sin mentality. And now it's reject the sinner, only listen to me if you agree with me.
yeah,
And if people are writing laws on that, this is kind of where I'm going with that is if people are writing laws on something that's going to impact the entire nation, but it's people who are looking at it textually, like you're saying, but it's textually based off of the current pulse of America. One, is that actually Christian? And two, where does that go from here? Because that is really just allowing somebody to do whatever they want and then justifying their means by saying, well, this is biblical for us.
Yeah, and I think that at least what we tried to model for you uh, was we certainly talked about cultural acceptance of tattoos before you got tattooed, but we really just wanted you to be aware of what you were getting into. That you've got to go for a job interview, and at the time, going for a job interview with a tattoo was uh, was difficult. But I don't think we might have brought things up like that and said, "Oh, well, some people in the church aren't gonna accept. They're just not going to accept you." But I think that's always been the case. I mean, there's always been, um, particularly with Protestantism. Protestantism started in the 16th century, and it was really a precursor to the Enlightenment. Um, but everything that happened in the Enlightenment happened first in Protestantism. They rejected tradition. They rejected um, the traditional authority structures. They embraced new um, theories of existence. So I think there's always been um, uh, and particularly within Protestantism, there's that protesting, that fracturing, that, oh well, I'm not going to be part of the Catholic Church, has just spiraled. So it's like, oh, okay, well, first there were Lutherans, and then there were Anabaptists, and then there was this, that, and the other thing, and now there are literally tens of thousands of uh, Protestant denominations around the world. But then you compare that to the Catholic Church, where it's literally one worldwide church. And like just this last week, the this is a good example. The Pope released a letter about AI, and uh, and so theologians are like they're like, oh, okay, well, what does this technology um, say about humanity? What are moral uses for this tool, and what are immoral uses for this tool? And uh, and to be able to have the kind of moral clarity to say this is definitively true. Whereas, um, uh, you know, just in the short time, relatively short, in terms of like it's 20, 30 years for us. But when you compare that to the entire time of history, of Christian history, there's uh, things don't change nearly as quickly as they do in society.
So I think one of the things that I think of with more recently that's happened is and granted this is Episcopalian, so it's not Catholicism, but the Reverend Marianne Bood is it Booty or Buddy from the DC church that Trump had attended his first
I don't
service
know how
to.
you pronounce it. I heard what she said to the
Yeah.
president and I heard that clip.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that what was always funny to me about Satanism to me and the Satanic Temple is a lot of the values in my mind they actually really mirrored Jesus as they were looking for the downtrodden. They were looking for the people that nobody else was taking care of, and they were actually going out and doing the work that a lot of people weren't doing for communities that were marginalized. And when I'm listening to Marianne speak, it's like, yeah, those are the values of Jesus, of the New Testament Jesus that I grew up listening to. Like this is a message that, like, regardless of your politics, does back what it is that the message of that man was. And then politicians that are supporting the administration are saying that it's the least Christian thing that's been said. And I'm having a really hard time grasping how the love and compassion, and this is the same woman who opened up her church for a burial for Matthew Shepard when he was killed over 20 years ago. So she's been consistent with her values, even when it was controversial to be someone who's accepting of that community. So I don't think that this is somebody who's doing it for political points as much as I really do think that she understands the heart of the personage of Jesus. And the rejection of that value from people who claim to champion it, that's concerning. And I don't understand how Christians don't recognize that that isn't concerning, or that that's concerning.
Yeah, I think, and this is kind of a cultural thing. Now, if if someone is a Republican, they kind of like think of themselves as an evangelical, because the word evangelical has become synonymous with um, being a Republican. And the same thing happens on the other side of the political spectrum. The Episcopal Church is a really good example of that, in that uh, for them, um, uh, Christianity has become synonymous uh, with progressive politics as it's manifest in the U.S. So, and you see that, I mean, if you go to an Episcopal church, you're going to see, all kinds of symbols, uh, you know, uh, for one particular side of the political aisle. And if you go to a, a Baptist church or a Presbyterian church, a conservative Presbyterian church, you're going to see, all kinds of material for the other side of the political aisle. And for many, many people within Christendom, um, their faith has been co-opted by politics. Um, and again, the Catholic Church is really interesting in that they've got really three sources of authority. They've got the in terms of text, they've got the Bible. Then they've got what's called the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is kind of like a big theology document. Says these are the beliefs of the church. But then they've got another book that's called the Social Compendium of Catholic Thought, and that's okay. Well, here's what we believe. Now, how does that work in the world? So, so politics within the Catholic Church are very, very diverse. Um, you know, there's the Catholic Church is very much in favor of immigration. The Pope has been very, very critical of not only the United States, but many of the countries in Europe that are trying to close their borders because the Pope feels that God is on the side of the migrant. Um, but that same church that is for the migrant is very much for the unborn child, um, which which I mean, if you look at that in terms of the American perspective of religion, well, only the liberal churches are for immigration, and only the conservative churches are for um, uh, preserving life in an unborn child. So, the Catholic perspective isn't either one of those, because America is just one country out of many countries in the Catholic Church. And like the Catholic Church just this past year had what they call the Synod on Synodality, which was it's a big meeting of all these bishops that met for a couple of years consecutively in Rome. But so, the American bishops that were there were alongside bishops from China and Brazil and Ukraine and all over the world. And politics in America is a very unique beast. Um, and it's a unique beast in uh, that one of the aspects that makes it unique is it's unique in the way that it has infiltrated the religious communities, with all uh, liberals being in liberal denominations and all conservatives being in conservative denominations, and they really don't view their religion as being doctrinal. They view the religion as being political. I'm a Baptist, therefore I'm a Republican. I'm an Episcopalian, therefore I'm a Democrat.
So isn't that the goal of most churches though, is to go out and spread your interpretation of the gospel? And I guess that's kind of an interesting thing to take note of with American Christianity in general, then, is how splintered it is. Because that was always one of the issues that whenever we moved from church to church to church, that never made sense to me, was the fact that, all right, there's no really unified message between all of this. It's like this church does it this way, this church does it that way, this church does it this way. There's all one message that's kind of understood. And it's like, I mean, I've read the Bible enough. But if no one really has the answers because everybody has a different interpretation of it, then how is this really worth putting my time and efforts into? So it's interesting because that actually makes a lot more sense with what would draw you to Catholicism at that point, is because it's much bigger than the broken, splintered system that America has with many other things as well.
Yeah, that's very much part of what drew me to Catholicism, was just my own frustration with with that aspect of Protestantism, where um, it's like the only time Protestants will call themselves Protestants is when they're being compared to Catholics. But there's nothing unified about Protestantism. They're they're very fractious and very splintered, and um, uh, and there's no way for a single authoritative voice to say this is what truth is. So you end up with all these different interpretations of what truth is, and I understand how that is. So, like when you read, if you just read the words of Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus was a very coy speaker. He used a whole lot uh, of hyperbole and figurative speech. Um, so even the apostles, even his own disciples would go to him and were like, "We have no idea what you just said. Can you explain it to us?" And then he would explain what he had said, but he always used these these figurative metaphors to talk about truth. So when you've got figurative speech, well, you can there's you can make the figures into something that they're not, or you can. I mean, I'll use a good example of the the story of uh, of the parable of the mustard seed. So in this story, which is a parable, so the first thing is it's a type of story that uses hyperbole, and and it talks about mustard seed being the smallest seed that exists, and then it grows into a tree that's so big that birds can nest in it. Now, neither of those two things are true. A mustard seed is a very small seed, but it's nowhere near the smallest seed that exists. I mean, if you think about the spores on a mushroom, or I mean, there's just like lots of
Yeah.
really tiny seeds. So that's number one. And then number two, the mustard plant is more like a bush. It's not a tree. And I mean, I guess small birds can kind of like hide inside it, but
So
they're
so
not.
what we can really learn is Jesus doesn't know shit about botany.
Well, but it's he isn't trying to teach a science lesson. He's trying to teach this principle that if you're faithful with a little, it will grow into something great. Your business is a good example of that. If you're faithful with a little, if you start with an idea that's a good seed, and then you just continue trying to work that principle, it grows into something greater. So when you see the figure for what it is, the story isn't about a seed and a tree. The story is about growth and and uh, and the principle of being faithful to what you originally wanted, and to stay faithful to that, and to grow through your values is so. But people are like, oh well, he said that it's the smallest seed and it's not the smallest seed, so it's not true. That's not the issue. It's just the Bible is not intended to be a science book. It's a book about uh, who humans are, who God is, and how humans and God can come together in uh, in what is referred to as a kingdom of God, to where the things on earth mirror the things that are in heaven.
So I guess this circling back to the very first question that I had asked, which is the kingdom of heaven is like obviously the thing that comes next. So what is it that, based on your views in Catholicism, is your idea of what comes next? What is that to you?
There's so one of the interesting things about uh, that whole kingdom of God thing is I think that one of the best ways to explain it is it's an already and not yet. So so the already uh, is is what Jesus was talking about. He's like, oh, okay, uh, you know, um, uh, uh, to uh, to give yourself over to God, who is love, so that in giving yourself over to this God who is love, you can then give your love over to the world. Um, so it's kind of transactional in that it begins as love, and the love comes into this person, and then that person takes that same love and extends it to others. So that's the kingdom that is already here. So we don't have to wait for the second coming of Christ, or you know uh some flash and a bang and trumpet sounding, and then there's this triumphant entry. And a lot of people, that's all they think of. They're like, oh, well, you got to believe this so that you can go to heaven. Um, but then you have to stop and think. It's like, okay, well, what is heaven? Is heaven the skies when when Jesus ascended up into the heavens, is he like the um like a satellite, like the what are those two satellites that we sent? I can't believe I can't remember it. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2.
Yeah.
They're so they're you know that so somehow Jesus ascended and he's just somewhere in space continuing to ascend, moving off towards that doesn't make any
You know,
sense.
Elon already ruined the movement. You may want to watch your arm gestures a little bit.
Sorry about that. I totally there's a it was totally unintentional. But the so so there's this again. So I'm going to kind of pull back from religion for a little bit and get into physics, metaphysics. So so uh, one of the things that one of the very foundational things that people uh, uh, that are physically minded, that are uh, is what is the nature of substance? So how do things exist? So we know that there is material, there's matter, there's atoms, there's molecules, uh, there's planets and planetary bodies. There's all these physical things. Um, and some people think that's all there is. There's, everything consists of atoms and subatomic particles and protons and quarks, and everything that exists somehow physically. Um, but then you kind of have to look at other things. So, like, okay, well, what is the mind? So, you know, uh, is a mind just the substance of our thoughts? But if you think about our thoughts, um, we're what I like to call creatures in dialogue. We are creatures in dialogue. So inside our head, we have thoughts, but we can have competing thoughts inside our heads. And then not only can we have competing thoughts completely independent of one another, we can have uh, those competing thoughts and then emotions about each of those thoughts. And we, inside our head, we're in a dialogue between this thought and this feeling and this feeling. So the uh, so I mean I there's so where does that mind come from? And like even the smallest child, when they do something mischievous, they know they did something wrong. They just have this innate sense of right and wrong. And almost everybody, universally, almost everybody, regardless of what their religion is, will say that stealing is wrong, rape is wrong, murder is wrong. So we've got this sense of right and wrong that has to come from somewhere. And it's not something that comes to us necessarily through a religion, because people who are completely irreligious have the same sense of right and wrong. So my argument would be that that our mind is separate. It's not physical. It's not made of matter, and that we as humans are are both creatures of substance. Our substance is creatures of matter, and also immaterial substances like our mind. Um, I would also argue that we have a spirit, um, and that spirit works within our mind and our body, and it gives us a driving force. So that's so on the philosophical side, that's the difference between being a substantive monist and a substantive pluralist. So if you're a substantive monist, you only believe that there's only matter, or that there's only immaterial substance. So when people just say, "Oh, we're living in a simulation," um, and nothing that exists is real, we're all just like part of a code somewhere. That would be a monist view, but it's the opposite of a materialist. It's a spiritist. It's where we only exist as immaterial. But if you're a substantive pluralist, then you're like, oh, well, there are things that exist that we cannot measure with a ruler or with a telescope. Um, and my mind isn't just electrical signals being batted around inside my brain. There's some other immaterial substance that is part of me. So for me, that's the real core of how humans interact. Uh, sometimes you go into a room and or you'll meet somebody and you'll get a good vibe, or you'll get a bad vibe about that person. Well, I kind of think those vibes that we get are because our spirits actually exist and they communicate with us by saying, "Oh, this is a good thing and this is a bad thing." Um, and I don't know how I got here in our conversation, but um, there's I think that, oh, now I know what it is. So you have to be able to take what the Bible teaches about God, which I believe is true. I think what the Bible teaches about God is true. But uh, but in order for God to teach us about Himself, He reveals Himself to us. In order for Him to do that, He has to use language that we can understand. Um, and He's chosen to use people at a particular point in time. So, like uh, Abraham, uh, had slaves. He had a daughter, or he had a son by a slave. Um, and do I think that uh, God likes slavery because there's an example of a slaveholder in the Bible? No, I think God hates slavery. That's one of the whole reasons for the story of the Exodus, is that God doesn't want people to be in bondage. There's but but in Abraham's day, that wasn't a that wasn't a an unheard of thing. Um, so uh, there's it it wouldn't have been possible for Abraham to say to to reject slavery, because it was part of literally every place that he was in. So God used him at that particular time to write part of the Bible. But then, as there's this progressive revelation that took place all the way through the New Testament, in which there were still slaves. So I think you have to kind of recognize that because the Bible is a book that has dual authorship. So there's these, there's you know uh, 66 different human authors that wrote the various books. Actually, more than that, if you think about the Psalms and the Proverbs, there's lots of different people who wrote the accounts that ended up being contained in the library. That's the Bible. There's but there's also this divine voice, and the divine voice is what's trying to communicate spiritual truth through these human narratives. Um, and that's the part of religion that fascinates me.
Okay. I had something and it completely derailed as you were explaining. Um, I I don't know. I understand how it fascinates you. I think that this is one of those things that, experientially, it's it's like what you're saying is, it's something that you will be feel called to, and that's one of the things that I I don't. And what's been really interesting is that entering the 10th dimensional idea and mindset, that actually shaped a lot of my views of where it is that I view what the next space is. And that's I understand the whole it is something that has already happened and has yet to happen, and that it'll speak to you in the way that it does. But I do think that there is something that's larger than this, and I do think that they were all kind of connected to whatever the thing is that's out there. And I think that uh what you've kind of touched on a little bit is you have a personal theology, and it's a personal walk with God. And I think that that's one of the things that growing up always made sense to me is it's not necessarily how does the church do things, but how do you relate with whatever it is that's the thing that's bigger than yourself. And for me, that was one of the reasons why I always went out camping by myself. Like nothing makes me feel more connected to something bigger than myself than being completely isolated in the middle of nowhere, having to rely on myself and realizing one mistake and I'm literally nothing. And I a few years ago had a really, really, really large psychedelic experience that kind of shaped a lot of my views towards what this existence actually is. And I really did feel connected to something larger than myself. And that was one of the things that was a big focal point on that book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, is exactly what you're talking about. It's Jesus's love, and he is this thing that is showing love is a cycle, that because it loves you, you have love in you, and you progress love to something else. And I had never felt something so much love and connected to others other than when I had had this nearly 5 gram trip on mushrooms out in the middle of nowhere. And one of the things that opened up in my mind was the different ways that God would reveal itself to me, or not necessarily God, but whatever it is, whatever the thing is that's larger than me, the abstract thing, the blanket. That's I think that's I'm just gonna start calling God Blanky. Uh, and for me, a lot of the ties between non-theistic science and what religion speaks of, and then that mysticism that's in the middle, I always came back to that seventh dimensional concept of a being that is much larger than ourselves. And to me, it makes more sense that we're kind of the living experiences of something that's larger than ourselves, and we will go back into it. And it's more of a lot of people call it collected consciousness, or it's the one mind theory. But when I think about what our experience is, I think we're a three-dimensional projection of what will become the memories for a being that's larger than ourselves. So when it's described as you'll be reunited with all of your family, and all will be known and all will be revealed, and there'll be no secrets, and it is a complete uh reunification of everyone that's ever been in your life. To me, that's like, yeah, we're all going in the tank together. Like we're all gonna know everything, and we're gonna be connected. And the interesting and weird things for me is when I think about like Neuralink, and some of the things that were talked about in the early process of that, and being able to have kind of like that Borg collective mind where, okay, one person can know something, and then it's on a network, and everyone connected to that network can just know what that is. And conceptually, that's something that they're working on. That's within the function of what that science is proving possible. And if that's a direction that we're already going, that also makes sense that that's the direction that we could be going on a grander scale as well, is all into this oneness with each other. And for me, thinking that that's the concept of what it is, All right, well then I want to be above reproach with all my actions. If you are simply another experience of me, experienced at a later time and a greater experience, but we get to know and we will have that kind of connection with one another. I wouldn't want to do anything to harm you, and I would want the best for you because that's in my collective interest for creating the best version of myself that goes back into that collectedness for all of us anyways. And for me, it's something that actually creates the morality in itself, which I can, see where the argument comes from of like, the golden rule of do unto others as they would have done unto you. Because that really does solidify it for me of, I don't know what this thing is, but I think we're all going to go back to it at some point. And I think that it will give a greater understanding of what morality looks like, and humans will define morality how they define it. But I think that once we're all a part of this oneness, then it will become a better understanding of why decisions were made, because this is the movement of the experience that it was having.
Yeah, there's what that sounded like to me was a very spiritist perspective that there's um um uh, there uh that in the end we all become this uh this nebulous spiritual being where everyone is connected to everyone else. um and that's there's one of the things that's uh uh interesting to me. Well, I don't know if it's interesting, but I think it's important. Is you know the 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 concept of human dignity, that everybody is valuable just as they are, because they're human beings. Um, and how that manifests is is mostly through respect. Um, something that is dignified, you give respect and honor to, and I think that that in in these kinds of conversations, there's often a lack of respect. It's like, oh, okay, and I think part of that lack of respect is it's like, oh, okay, well, I believe that I'm right, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a Christian, and therefore I'm like, oh, okay, well, I believe Christianity to be true. Um, so if I am wrong, if you're right, then I have to be wrong. So I defend myself. I right away feel, I'm using this as a, I'm not saying this is how I feel, but I'm just saying this as an example.
No, I'm
Um,
already offended. I'm already offended.
Yeah, people are like, oh man, well, I've got to defend myself because I have to prove myself to be right, and the only way for me to be right is for you to be wrong. And I think that ends up being um, this two things. One, it's you see the entire rest of the world as objectives to be won. So I'm talking to this person, so I have to convince this person to believe what I believe, because that's what's going to validate my own beliefs by making someone else believe what I believe. Um, and you're never in that dialogue trying to listen to what the other person is saying. You know what I mean? And to say, you know what, it's okay. It's okay for you to believe what you believe and for me to believe what I believe. And those two things don't have to be the exact the exact same. Because I think um, a lot of times people will say that will think that the opposite of faith is doubt. So if I have faith in something, then it's like this unshakable belief. And if I have doubt, then that doubt takes away from the faith. But really, if you think about it, the opposite of faith is certainty. There's you. The only reason that you have faith is because there's a little bit of mystery to it. In fact, in a lot of things, there's a lot of mystery to it. So, you ask, well, what is the end game of Christianity? And I know all kinds of people who would be like, well, I believe this. They even can put a label on it. I'm
Gonna
a
be
this
pearly
school.
gates, roads of gold.
Yeah, people are like, hey, man, I know exactly what's going to happen, and I know that what I believe is that humans are eternal creations. We were made um, with lasting properties that are beyond our physicality. Um, but but I also know that we use language to describe God because we need something to understand. I don't, my view of God is not an old man with white flowing hair and a big beard and reaching out to touch. That's that's whatever that image is. It is not the true nature of God. So, what is that true nature of God? I don't know. Um, but theology is the science of learning what is knowable about God. Um, so, uh, in a lot of ways, it's a science about just a tiny little bitty fraction of of the available knowledge, or the total knowledge of what is the true God. But it's very similar to anthropology, the study of humans. So if I'm an anthropologist and I'm participating in some scientific discipline, some scientific study about the nature of humans. Well, I mean, if you think about that, most humans don't even really understand the nature of themselves because we're so complex. And we're like, well, I thought I was this, but then I realized I was that. And to make it even more complex, throughout our entire physical life cycle, we change. So, I'm at when I'm now at 60, but when I was 40, I was a very different person than I am right now. There's an old saying that a person never visits the same river twice, because whenever a person goes to a river, both of those entities are changed. The water that's at the river isn't the same as it was before, and the human that comes to the water isn't the same that they were before either, because we're constantly, constantly changing. And I think
Yep.
that's one of. Go ahead.
Oh, it's I don't know if I had sent you links to that book, but it was the it's the book that I had read from the second season of Ted Lasso, The Middle Passage. Um and
I haven't
and
read it yet.
Yeah, it's a fantastic read, and it talks about how every 7 years you go through a complete psychological change and you just shift directions. And that's one of the reasons that a midlife crisis occurs around 35 or 40 is it's a unique perspective to where we're at currently with medicine, because we used to not live this long, like 150 years ago, you made it to my age. Awesome. You did great. Make it to your age. Good on you. And the idea of humans living this long is such a new concept, that midlife crisis is because the person you were at 7 is not the person you were when you were going through puberty at 14. And when you were a young adult at 21, you weren't the teenager. And when you had the experience at 28, you were different. By the time you're 35, you've had enough changes in your life that you don't have any idea of what the next half of your life is going to look like. And that's kind of what the whole concept of this book, The Middle Passage, is. But yeah, I mean, you're constantly learning, you're constantly taking new information. And I think that one of the things that you're touching on here is this is one of the things where I think actually being able to have respect in these conversations really adds benefit to relationship. And it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to be able to do this podcast with you is I think that this is an area that people have a huge shortcoming in is they don't necessarily know how to be able to have a conversation and just simply get to a point where you say, okay, that's what you believe. Yeah, yeah. You believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe, and that's totally fine. It's perfectly acceptable, and that's genuinely one of the coolest parts about America is it's one of the few places in the world that we have a true demonstration of that really weird experiment. And I think that being able to show that respect in conversations, especially when you know you're not trying to bring the other person to your side of the aisle, but you're simply just trying to get a better understanding of what that person is coming from and where their perspective is, it really does give you a better idea. The concept in my mind for the last year of my dad being Catholic, it's been a very it's been a weird pill to swallow. Like it's just been so left field. And this is one of the things that knowing how to navigate these kind of conversations, it makes sense to me now. I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to get into the mysticism for myself. And I don't think that that's ever your goal because this is supposed to be your relationship with your maker and not seeking validation from your son.
Yeah, there's and uh, you know, I completely agree with the notion of you know that's what that's what makes America so great. I mean, the United States of America. There's uh, and this was a good thing about Protestantism because like the Protestant Reformation really is what drove the creation of the United States. If you look at the Columbian Contact, um, when the American continents were contacted by the Europeans, and everything here changed. Well, everything in Canada and the northern parts of the Midwest was developed by French Catholics, and everything in from South America all the way through the southwestern United States, California, there's was developed by Spanish Catholics. But uh, the driving force that went from east to west, boom, all the way across, and made the nation that is now the United States of America. They were Protestants, and they were there's so there's and they very much lived through periods where you know uh, uh, you know people were drowned and burned at the stake um, and tortured for disagreeing with particular aspects of of a religion. I mean, it was really really brutal in Europe. Um, uh, as the Reformation, expanded. So, the people who came to the U.S., they were like, you know what? We need to be able to let the people in Massachusetts believe what they believe, let the people in Virginia believe what they believe, let the people in Maryland believe what they believe. But in the midst of that diversity, we're going to create a federal unity. And that's the American experiment that you're talking about. That that and it's not that, oh, okay, I'm going to tolerate who those people are. I'm gonna ex- not only accept but celebrate the fact that they are who they are, uh, and I don't have to be like them in order for us to claim the name of American, which is very very different from the rest of the rest of the countries in the world. And what's unique about it is people who say, well, that's un-American or this is the American way. What they're really saying is this is the America that I know. The America that I know fits within these boundaries. But if you look at the America that actually exists, it's 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 actually many nations in one.
So on that, I think that that's actually kind of a good segue with everything that's been going on this last week with removing the DEI policies within the federal government. And I think that, what it is that you're suggesting is that we really should be celebrating and we should be making it where we're able to be a nation of many, many tribes. And I think it's one of those things that racism is kind of like cancer. It's one of those things we're hoping for a cure, but I don't think a cure is coming anytime soon. And I think that there should be protections that are available for marginalized communities that are trying to find their space, especially in an everly more populated nation and as more and more people move in. So how is it that all of the removal of DEI can be viewed as an American value when we've always been a melting pot?
Well, a couple things. One, so way back in 1997, I don't know if you remember it. We were in Dahlonega,
Hmm.
and I went to a school that was down in Florida. But I would leave and I would go down to Florida during the week, and I was coming home on the weekends. But the school I went to is was the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute. So um, the so I became an equal opportunity manager. A lot of people take that as their job when they graduate to school, but I really liked being an infantryman. So they wanted me to go to the school. I went to the school, but I didn't change my job because I wanted to remain as an infantryman for the rest of my career. But so that the 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 principles that of diversity and inclusion have always been, well, not always, but they have been part of the military culture for a very, very long time. Um, and uh, the but the manifestation of that um, in the last, I mean, I'm going to say 5, 10 years has been very, very different than uh, than is what has traditionally been the case um, within the U.S.
And to
Uh,
your point, that's one of the things that I constantly talk about when we moved to Idaho in 2002. When we moved here and I was 16 and I talked to all the friends that I started becoming newly acquainted with, most of them had never been out of the state. So none of them had ever seen any kind of diversity outside of, rural Treasure Valley. And growing up, diversity it wasn't anything. It was just like, yeah, this guy's dad is from there, this guy's dad's from there, this guy's dad's from there, we're all here. We had it's not like there was different neighborhoods that the only neighborhood you didn't hang out with was the officers kids because they're officers kids. uh, and but other than that, it's like you have a huge amount of diversity that's kind of thrust upon you, and you accept it for what it is because there's no other option. That's diversity is a part of it. Like it's just ingrained in it, regardless of whether or not you want it to be.
yeah, this is where I think critical theory comes in. It's been co-opted in some incorrect ways, but it's really an important concept, I think, to understand. So critical theory is actually a literary term, um, and I think you'll really understand this. So, like, if you've got a, like the the J.R.R. Tolkien series of books, or the Harry Potter series of books, or the look at the Star Wars movies where there are multiple tales, right? So if you just pick up the third book in the series and read it without reading the first and second book, you're going to have a very different understanding of what that book is. So what uh, and those book series take advantage of this literary theory called critical theory. So uh, it basically has three components. There's a prefiguration, there's a figuration, and then there's a refiguration. So the prefiguration is who you come to the book as, right? So or you can even think of it as, I read a book, and then after I read the book, I'm going to a movie. So when I go into the movie, I'm expecting what I read in the book to happen in the movie, but then my expectation isn't met. It's like, oh, okay, you what message does that movie send to me? Is it less than? Is it greater than? How do I change as a result of that? So that's the that that prefiguration is how you approach something. A figuration is the thing that you approach, and then the refiguration is how that makes you in the future. So I read the first book in the series, and uh, that really hooked me onto it. Now I'm into magic, and I like all this stuff, and I've read it a couple times. And then there's another book that comes out, and I go, oh, okay. Well, I'm going to read this book, but when I read this book, I'm the person that exists because I read the first book. The first book changed me in a way. So that's and Star Wars actually turned was the at least the first that I know of that turned that on its head, in that the sequencing of the story reversed. So it's like, oh, now when you see the third movie, you have to go back and watch the first one and the second one, because the third one happened before then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's and so now when you get into race and gender and all these other uh, 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 issues that they try and apply that theory to, so people come to um, their understanding of race from the understanding that they have. So a person that grows up in Idaho never leaves their that state, never sees anybody before that. They have a prefiguration. So when they're confronted um, with a racial circumstance, they don't have any prefiguration. All their prefiguration is everybody is exactly like me. So then they see all of a sudden these things that are not like them, and they have to try and figure out how to put that new thing into their previous self. And that what they come out with is refiguration. So a lot of, and all this is really to just talk about, when we talk about the term gaslighting, you hear that a lot in today's society, gaslighting. What gaslighting is it's trying to influence the prefiguration. It's trying to make it uh, so that everybody comes to the problem with the same uh, set of solutions, that they're all the same. Um, so critical race theory requires that a person who is white transforms their view of themselves so that it fits into the same view that people who are non-white have of whites, because because I have to I have to adjust the prefiguration. So when I come to society, if I come to society and I'm just like, hey, I'm me and I'm just doing the best me that I can be, but I am white, then the gaslighting argument is, oh, well, you think that everybody is like you, but that's because you don't understand the plight of the of black slaves in America. You don't understand the plight of the conquered Native Americans. You don't understand all these issues. Um, and what it does, I think, is it creates a very harmful narrative for people that that have to see themselves as um, uh, as something that they're not, and the something that they're not is uh, uh, so. I mean, I could. We try and put people into two groups. There are the oppressed, right? So there's everybody who's oppressed, and they're repressed. They're oppressed because of their gender, of their sexual orientation, of their race, um, of their gender identity. There's all these people are oppressed. Well, when you have someone who is oppressed, you necessarily
Have to
have an
have an
oppressor.
oppressor.
That's exactly right. So everybody who does not fit into that oppressed mold um, is an oppressor. So the gaslighting narrative is that all white people are oppressors. The gaslighting narrative is that all men are oppressors. That all Christians are oppressors because it's all these other people. It's um, these people that have to be victims. So I
See, and
think that's
I disagree with that. I don't think that the narrative is that all are, because I can argue, knowing your heart, I don't think that you're an oppressor and you're, all three of these things. You're a white, you're a man, you're a Christian. But I think that what could be argued is that in the same way that you said that the things that were working for Israel were working for Israel in the time of Israel, historically people who have looked like us have been dealt a little bit of a better hand. And I think that the reality behind that in our nation is a reality. Like I don't think that that's anything that we can deny. Like even talking about Trump coming into office, with a lot of my clients that are very concerned. I'm like, I mean, historically speaking, my business will probably do well, like just realistically speaking. And there's a difference between taking pride in, like, I'm gonna get this because I'm gonna get this, even if I don't deserve this, and still working for it. I think that meritocracy absolutely has its place, but alongside meritocracy, that's where I think that um a lot of these policies, that not necessarily critical race theory specifically, but even like the equal employment opportunity, that was part of the executive action of laws that was repealed, and that was from, I think, 1963. And all that's really saying is that we need to ensure that when people have blind spots and they potentially have views that aren't truthfully aligned with what the reality of the greater America is, then we need to ensure that there are people who are marginalized can be a part of the opportunity that America has to offer. So I have a hard time with that, thinking that we can rely on people knowing that they'll have blind spots to be able to do the correct thing in being able to mm, be outside of their own purview, if that makes sense.
yeah. There's and uh, where I would, you know, uh, argue. probably on the other side of that is, so I was born in July of 1964, 1 week after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed. So for my entire life, uh, equal opportunity for people based on race, religion, national origin, gender, have have been by law in the United States equal. There's that that was solidified 1 year later with the Voting Rights Act, where so all of those folks have been able to vote without um, undue harassment, without any kind of so they've been everybody of all races, all genders, every nationality. If you're a citizen of the country, you can vote. Nobody's allowed to discriminate against you, and those laws have been in place and been enforced ever since then. So my mother grew up in when uh, you know anybody who would if you were white, you could go into the movie theater from the front. If you were black, you had to go
Segregation,
in.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's but that has not been so there. I'm 60, and my entire life that has not been the case. From 1974 on, not only has equality been the rule, but equity in terms of race and gender has been the case in employment and in college. Uh, there's because we started the Education Reform Act of 1974 uh, made it so that schools had to pay attention to quotas of race and gender in order to diversify their student body. So today there there are more women than men that are being awarded degrees of all kinds, except for 2 year degrees from community colleges. So men still lead women in getting 2 year degrees from community colleges, but women lead men in getting bachelor's degrees and getting master's degrees and in getting doctorate degrees, which is which which uh, doesn't lend itself to the argument that women are being oppressed in their ability to prepare for any kind of job that they want to have. If you look at the equality of pay, the Lilly Ledbetter Act was the first law that Barack Obama signed, um, and it's been tremendously successful. So women are either on par or in front of men in pay in almost every occupation except for engineering and C-suite jobs. So if you're a chief executive officer or a chief technology officer or a chief information officer in any corporation, you're more likely you're a man, you're going to get paid more than a woman. The so all of this oppression that people are claiming, if they're my age or younger, it just doesn't exist. It's a false argument, and it's a false argument that's designed to gaslight and keep people um, uh, uh, at each other's throats, and to say that, oh, okay, well, I'm an oppressed person. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing to tell a child, to say you are oppressed and you're never going to get ahead because these people are oppressing you, or you have to hate this group of people, you have to work against this group of people because they are oppressors, when that is just plain not true, and it hasn't been true. I mean, it was true beforehand. There's a we have a horrible history of race-based slavery in the United States. That race-based slavery was a horrible thing that existed all through South America, Central America, and into the southern parts of North America, for a very, very long time. But that, I mean, we're talking, way more than 150 years ago that was the case. Everything that was the Jim Crow period that lasted from uh, the cessation of the Civil War until the enactment of the Civil Rights Act doesn't exist anymore. It's just not true. So, so, uh, and again, one of the things that is traditional about the United States is that we are a progressive nation, that we have very much progressed in terms of equal opportunity for everyone, very much progressed in terms of um, uh, you know equal pay, equal justice in society. I think there's a if there's any place, literally any place in the U.S. that where where there's still a an evidenced racial divide, it's prison. That's there's but it's not like people are being thrown in prison in the United States because of their race, but there are other underlying sociological issues that make it so that black people are imprisoned way more than white people are in prison. So that segment of society is, and it's interesting that that the uh, uh, the Criminal Justice Reform Act that caused the tremendous increase in the um, uh, imprisonment of African Americans in the United States was written by Joe Biden when he was the chairman of
Mm-hmm.
the of the
It was when he was a senator, wasn't it?
yeah, he was in charge of the Senate Justice Committee. And so there's and and he became gaslighter in chief. Uh,
Well, I guess, the point that you're making kind of serves the purpose that I'm trying to make, which is that before we had those laws, it didn't work properly. It didn't work the way that it should have worked for those communities. And that's where the concern is with repealing these and getting rid of this DEI and inclusionary laws. Um, how is that going to make it so that way America doesn't potentially slip back into an era that we were in previously because where are the guardrails in that? When you think about how long it takes for a society to forget about things. One of the things that I always find really interesting is Vietnam and snipers and how after World War II, as a society, we just didn't need long range shooters. And then when we went to war next, we didn't have long range shooters in the military, so we had to have Olympians come and teach long range shooters to military people. And you're right. In your lifetime, that's never been an issue because those laws have been on the books and have been able to stand the test of time and saying, yeah, we want to make sure that these people are available. What happens when Elliot's your age and there's a battle? What happens when people haven't had those laws for their entire life and there's a decision made for the America of 2150? And I think that's one of the interesting things about when you're put into the position of being a world leader, you're thinking of the decisions, obviously, of the people that are in your nation at the time that you're running the nation, but you're also thinking of the legacy of your nation and what's going to happen down the line. And for me, removing a lot of these things seems to be able to give America the opportunity to forget the progress that we've actually made.
There's uh so so I I guess the first point I would make is, again, I'm 60, anybody who's my age or younger has grown up in a world where those barriers don't exist.
So are
Um,
you saying that, and so your faith in this is that because people have already changed societally, those laws don't need to exist. We will just continue, like we recognize this now.
no, no, what I'm saying is that those laws already exist, and when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, um, there was widespread uh, racism throughout the entire United States. It wasn't limited to the former Confederate states. So and when those laws changed, society didn't change when the law was passed.
No, that's
There's
what I was saying. Yeah, like racism is cancer. We don't have a cure for it yet.
Yeah, so when I was growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s, um, there was still a lot of racism. I went to school the first when I was living in Savannah as a child. I was bused to a school in downtown Savannah because the schools in Savannah were under a court order to integrate because they were just racially divided. So there was an elementary school that was just a couple blocks from where we were living behind Oglethorpe Mall, and you won't remember that. I said like you know that because you were born in Savannah, but
Right.
but so but I was put on a bus and bused into downtown Savannah in a neighborhood that was uh, completely black. It was an all black neighborhood, and I was living in an all white neighborhood. So, so when I would show up at this school, the bus would pull up alongside this huge fence. So it was a big, like 12-foot tall chain link fence with barbed wire at the top. And then the buses would stop, and there was like an entire tunnel of wire that we would walk through. And then I would get on the other side was the playground at the back of the school. So we had this wire, all these fences that protected us from who they were protecting us from, the people in that neighborhood, the black people in that neighborhood, and all the kids from that neighborhood. They didn't go through any wire. They went through the front door. They just went straight through the front door. So literally, they didn't have a black entrance and a white entrance with a sign over it, but they had a black entrance and a white entrance because all the black kids walked through the front door and all
Yeah.
the white kids got off the bus and went through the wire. In that school, there there was so much it wasn't racial tension, it was racial hatred. There's all the white kids sat in the back of on the back row in the back of the classroom. All the black kids sat in the front of the classroom. There's on the playground, the white kids all went to the very back side of the playground, and the black kids stayed on the side of the playground that was near the school. So every aspect of what that my existence was in that school in 1976 was a racially segregated society where white kids hated black kids. I don't think I ever saw a single fight at that school that was between two black kids or two white kids. Every fight I saw at that school was between a black kid and a white kid. And whenever there was a fight on the playground, it was like two sides of a donut. all the black kids on one side cheering on the black kid fighting, all the white kids on the other side. So it was very, and this was a decade after that law was enacted. So so uh, so laws are made in a single congressional session, right? So you write the law, you get it passed, and then the president signs it. But changing society to conform with that law is a different story. There's so from my experience in the 1960s, you could be a racist and there would be no social consequence. You could call people by horrible, horrible names. Nobody would say, "Hey, you ought not to call them that. That's wrong." The 1970s, that started to change a little bit, and people would use hushed tones because there was a little bit of a social consequence. People would be like, "Yeah, you're being racist," and they would kind of call you out on it. By the time the 1980s got here, if you used a racial slur towards someone, everybody around you would like look at you like you had a third head, and there was a very, very serious social consequence for racism. And that's when society started to change. And there's a and so like now, uh, I mean, again, I'll point to Barack Obama. If you are a black kid, you can become the president of the United States. That's not some far off, promise that was. There's
It's
in
that prefiguration you were talking about.
That's exactly right. So right now, the prefiguration of society has the expectation that a black person could be president, a woman could be president. There's no societal expectation that someone, because of some identifying characteristic, they wouldn't be able to rise to a position just because of that identifiable characteristic. I was watching a video last night on YouTube of the Sixth Ranger Training Battalion down in Florida, the Florida Phaser Ranger School. I was in the mountains. This is there, and they were teaching the Ranger students that are down there now. Um, it's called the snake handling class. So they got a bunch of snakes, and they were in this case they had this huge Eastern diamondback rattlesnake, and they were holding the snake, and they opened its mouth and were showing the fangs to the Ranger students, right?
So
Well,
this was at a Southern Baptist church.
yeah, yeah, exactly. That's funny. But what was interesting is the instructor that was teaching the class is a woman. So this woman is an instructor in Ranger School. Now think about that. There's just 15 years ago, nobody would have even dreamed that there would be a female who would go to Ranger School. But not only is that not the case anymore,
That's like
it's
cousin Lizzie. She's kicking ass and she's
yeah.
doing awesome. And she grew up in a world that really empowered her to be able to be the person that she is now. And like DEI aside, she would get the job because she kicks ass.
And that's my point. So that woman was able to become a ranger instructor because that's what she wanted to be, and there's no barriers to stop her. Um, and 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 that's not going to go away. That's so it's like in Idaho, you guys have a state legislature that um, is passing a resolution, or is trying to pass. I know the House has already passed it. Still got to get through the Senate. That is a resolution that asks the Supreme Court
To
to,
repeal same-sex marriage.
yeah. But see, here's the thing: there's that's not the way the Supreme Court works. A state legislature doesn't write a resolution and say, "Here, we want you to look at this law." The way that a law is reviewed is, first there has to be a case there. So somebody somewhere is going to have a case that says because this same-sex couple was married, it caused harm to me in some way. I'm there,
I can't
there's
think of a
so
single scenario where anyone's gonna be like, I lost my leg because she kissed a lady.
yeah. So what it's uh so the the policies that were put in place by Obergefell, and let's not forget that the Respect for Marriage Act was passed that repealed the Defense of Marriage Act, that said, and the Defense of Marriage Act that Joe Biden signed, by the way, he was a big supporter of the Defense of Marriage Act, said that marriage was between one man and one woman across the entire country. So the Respect for Marriage Act repealed that, and it said uh, that states have to recognize the marriages of another state, and uh, so my point being is that Obergefell is not only a Supreme Court decision, but after that Supreme Court decision, Congress acted and passed a law that that solidified that decision. Like in the case of the Dobbs decision that repealed Roe versus Wade, had, had Congress been able to come up with a law that governed um, uh, abortion services nationwide, then Dobbs would never have happened. But the reason that Dobbs happened was because there was never a law, because both sides are on way opposite ends and nobody's going to compromise. Had
See,
that
and
been the case,
that's where I think Idaho is actually using the argument from the Dobbs decision, because this was something that was being talked about a lot in my community when that first happened. Is that law was going to set the precedent for allowing states to go to the Supreme Court, because the whole thing was that states weren't allowed to make their own decision on abortion laws. And the argument that Idaho is making is that the state of Idaho is who was harmed because the federal government took away the state's ability to dictate what it is that they choose to be marriage within their own district and region. And do I think it's an asinine argument? Absolutely, it's an asinine argument. Stupid. And I think that that's the whole point of the federal government, is to have guardrails to govern the states to recognize. But I am more concerned that I think that Idaho might actually win the argument with the conservative justices that are in the Supreme Court, because of the way that the Dobbs decision was upheld.
but there's again that's just can't happen in our current system of government, because the Supreme Court does not consider resolutions passed by a state. So in order for that to happen, they would have Idaho would have had to create some law that was uh, in conflict with the Obergefell decision, and then somehow they would change that law in order uh, to please that one state. And there's no the that's not the way the Supreme Court works. So in order for a case to get to the Supreme Court that uh, that would cause them to reevaluate Obergefell, there would have to be a case where someone was harmed. And in the case of the abortion law, the Dobbs decision, it wasn't difficult to find people who had been harmed by abortion services in a legal sense. Um, there's there's and it, the it's I guess what I'm saying is that there's it's also important to, I think, understand that that the Dobbs decision and Roe were both about a medical procedure, and medical procedures are um, very tightly regulated by states. Have always been regulated by states. So when we use the term like abortion care is health care. Well, there's no right to health care in the United States. And if there was a right to health care,
We would have
uh,
universal health care, which is what we're all trying to fight for anyways.
yeah, and why would we have rights that only apply to one very specific procedure, but we don't have a right to chemotherapy. We don't have a right to uh, uh, to uh, to have a lung transplant. We don't have a right to a kidney transplant. We don't have so none of these other. We don't have a right to eyeglasses. We don't have a there's and there's but 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 that argument is that there is a right for this one particular uh, medical procedure, and and the way that the Roe decision was made uh, was these regulatory processes that have routinely been handled by state legislatures was just pulled out of thin air by the Supreme Court at the time. So we talk about activist judges or activist justices on the Supreme Court. That whole trimester, there is nothing in the human development cycle of a fetus that is divisible by three. Humans develop uh, very, very fast in the first 16 weeks of their development. So very, very quickly, the child um, builds uh, a a circulatory system with a beating heart, and very quickly they build a nervous system with a brain and with nerves that go everywhere. They they have eyes. They have so they're really just a very, 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 very tiny little bitty human being at 16 weeks. And then once that rapid development has already taken place, then all those systems grow more slowly until they're born. So the difference between the 2 week difference between a fetus between 8 and 10 weeks is exponential. But if you take a 2 week difference from a child in the last 9 months, things are only getting bigger. There's it's not
It's kind of like a
so
ramp
it's
up phase and the development phase.
yeah. Um, so uh, so the notion that we should restrict abortions at beyond 6 months because somehow the baby beyond 6 months is viable, which was again a term that was just pulled out of thin air by the Supreme Court in that Roe decision, which is completely ridiculous. A child that is 9 months out of the womb, so a 9 month old baby, they they are not uh, a viable human being that can live on their own.
No, they're gonna
They
die.
That's exactly right. If you
You're
take
not
a
really viable until you're at least a toddler.
That's exactly right. So what there's but then you've got this other side of the problem. There's where and it literally goes all the way back to I think it was 1962 when birth control pills were uh, first released. So before the birth control pill, uh, there was a very real uh, tangible risk that tempered people's um, sexuality, and that very real risk was you were gonna somebody very might get very well might get pregnant. The but the creation of the birth control did two things. One, it allowed for the sexual revolution that followed in the 1960s. So the whole free love summer was empowered by birth controls. And the second thing that it did is it started making careers and college and careers possible for women. So so more women started going to college and more women started going into the workplace because
They could
of
push back being a mom. They could
exactly.
make family planning a priority.
Yeah, so there's and that created a demand for uh, 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 for abortion services because the free love didn't everybody didn't use a condom, so it empowered. Anyway, so um, my my point with the whole viability. What is the real issue when it comes to aborting a human? There's and for me the I mean, so I recognize that we live in a society where abortions are going to take place. It's a there in many cases they're necessary just because of illnesses or abnormalities in the unborn human. And in many cases, they're just because somebody made a mistake, had a regretful night, and then they ended up pregnant. So now they need an abortion. So I recognize we live in a society where those abortions are going to take place, and for me, where the human dignity comes in place is pain. So um, so we have uh, you know uh, babies who at 15 weeks gestation have open heart surgeries inside the womb, and abnormalities in the heart are repaired, and the baby's born with a normal heart, and they survive the pregnancy, and that happens in our world. And because it happens, um, the medical societies have decided that beyond 15 weeks, if you're doing surgery on a child inside the womb, you have to provide that child with pain management uh, as part of the procedure. So, there's not, for a while they were just given the mother pain medicine, and that pain medicine they were thinking that it would transfer into the infant, but that's just plain not the case. So now they have when they go into the womb, the very first thing they do is they administer pain medication to the infant so they don't feel their chest being ripped open and their heart being repaired and then their chest closed and stitched back up and all the things that take place. Uh, um, and the reason is because, I mean, we kind of know this just by uh, circumstance. So, like, you'll see mothers will play music for their child uh, because they know that soothing music will put them to sleep and they'll stop kicking or whatever. And we've got studies now that where they do the exact opposite, where they play unpleasant sounds through a speaker into the womb, and you can see through the ultrasound, you can see the child grimacing and trying to turn away from that pain. So now we know that this child not only can feel pain, but they have enough awareness of self that they turn their body in order to get away
Reject
from
it.
in order to get away from the thing that's causing them pain. So where I think that it would be useful to try and get national legislation with regard to abortion is to make early abortion care very easy to get and uh, and very inexpensive. So we encourage women that are getting uh, a an abortion of choice for whatever reason they're choosing, get those abortions done early, get them done through medication and not surgery, um, so that it doesn't reduce the number of abortions, but and then beyond that. So somewhere between 13 and 16 weeks, I would argue for 15 weeks as being, we absolutely know that those human babies feel pain. Say if you're going to give an abortion beyond that, there's no restriction on giving the abortion, except for prior to the abortion procedure, you have to provide pain management for that child so that they don't, because I mean, the way that it is now, it's gross, but the way that it is now is they're either stuck apart into little pieces by a vacuum, or they're torn apart by forceps during a DNC procedure.
Right.
And and they can totally feel that. There's so there's it's like we look at pigs in gestation crates and we're like, this is cruel. How can you put a pig in a gestation crate? We tear children apart inside the womb, causing them unbelievable. And I'll even go to that same thing for a slaughterhouse. When you bring a cattle into a slaughterhouse, the very first thing they do before they butcher that cow, they kill it. They take and there's different ways that they do it, but they'll like drive a spike through its forehead. Uh, but they make
Pressurized
sure,
air or anything, but you're not torturing it.
yeah. So and I think that would do two things. One, it would on one for me, preventing that torturous act is just a sheer act of humanity, and I think that ending that amount of suffering is worthwhile. But it also acknowledges the two sides, saying, "Oh, okay, abortions are going to happen, and whatever the reason that you're having an abortion, you can have it if you get it done early and get it done by medication instead of surgery. Then it's very inexpensive, very easy to get, no controls whatsoever. If you wait too long, then the procedure is going to be more difficult to obtain and more expensive because you're going to also have to pay to provide pain management services for the child before they're killed."
And there's probably a better argument to restrict the reasoning on that, because if you are going to be ending the life of something that can actually feel pain at that point, then you could say these are situations where the mother's life is in danger, or rape or incest, or any of these situations where you would still want to have it available, but not necessarily have it be available for a choice. Or are you saying that because of the cost prohibitive nature of it, if somebody wants to make that choice, that should still be available for them, and the legislation should just kind of go by the wayside on it?
There's, and to me, I think that's the compromise. There's because um, uh, so I'll just use Colorado as an example. Um, Colorado is an abortion magnet state. So since the Dobbs decision, abortions in Colorado have tripled, have tripled. And the reason that the abortions in Colorado have tripled is because people from Texas and Alabama are coming to Colorado to have abortions. Um, uh, and The number of late term abortions, where where I mean the and see, this is one of the other things. This is a little bit of an aside, but it's personal for me. There's so uh, one of the things that Roe did is because like nobody in the medical community had ever used terms like viability, and nobody was thinking about trimesters because again, there's nothing in the human development cycle that is divisible by three. So, um, so doctors started to ask the question, well, when is a, an infant viable? When is a child able to live outside of their mother's womb? And because of that, neonatal intensive care units started springing up all around the country. And babies that were born prematurely that uh, that prior to Roe, nobody was even trying to save them. They were just like, "Oh, your baby's being born; it's going to die because it's too early." Um, and and then all of a sudden, after that decision, doctors were like, "Hmm, I wonder what it really is." So they started trying to, uh, and and the reason it's personal for me is because your brother was born 8 weeks early, and uh, and uh, the reason that he was able to live is because uh, uh, is is because of the procedures that were um, developed in direct reflection and direct response to Roe, where doctors were like, "Well, hey, let's see how early can we start saving these babies." And there's when your brother was born. I remember the first time I saw him. He was in an incubator, and he had this big metal mask on his face. It was like that movie from the guy who uh, was a villain that had a mask on his face or whatever. With
Oh,
there's
Man in the Iron Mask.
no different one where
Saw.
guy was like I can't remember. Anyway, he had this big metal mask that was helping him breathe, and you know before before that decision, if he couldn't breathe very well, he'd just die. But they figured out, oh well, we can do positive air pressure, just like a CPAP machine. We can put him on positive air pressure and use air pressure to make his lungs actually function. And that way he doesn't have to use up any calories because he was so tiny. He doesn't have to use up any calories trying to breathe. So they use positive air pressure to force his breathing with air that was supplemented in oxygen because he wasn't able to process. Anyway, they're so I just remember he was, I mean, perversely tiny. He was so small. This mask covered his entire head. He had, like he had a tube going in his head that was an IV. He had an IV with like two tubes in his umbilical cord. Um, there's he had his arm was all in a splint because he had an IV in his arm. He just had all this stuff, and if he wouldn't have had that stuff, he would have died. And so so uh, so I know that Brad was fully human when he was supposed to still be inside his mother's womb. And I know that he could feel pain because he cried a lot when they would come in and they would stick him on his foot to get blood samples to see how much oxygen was in his blood. So they'd stick him on his foot with a pin, and so his heels were like bruised because he kept getting his heels pricked. So, but every time they pricked him, he would scream and cry. So I know that he had a fully developed uh, uh, nervous system. And there's so now in Colorado, to get back to Colorado, the number of late term abortions and late term abortions are older than what your brother was when he was born in gestation age. There's a they've doubled, and the reason they've doubled is because women are having later abortions because they don't know where to go.
And
And
that's what I was going to ask is I would imagine that the increase in late term abortions, especially if you have it from people that are coming from other states, they're probably utilizing their resources trying to find something that's safe nearby. It's not available. They're trying to find an alternative. They're trying to use the auntie network. They're trying to find people. And all the while, time's passing. And then they're put into a place of desperation where okay, we got to go to Colorado. We've got to do this. And man, before I got my vasectomy, because that was the thing when Roe vs. Wade got overturned. The conversation that Haley and I had was, well, they're not coming after me. So, like, if we're really worried about family planning, and there's enough, neurological stuff for me that I don't want to pass it down to another generation. I'm perfectly fine with saying like the buck stops here. And prior to that, there was one time when we were like, maybe we want to have a kid, let's put down the defenses. Let's see what happens. And one day scored on the goalie, and for like a 48 hours we're like, oh my god, what were we thinking? This was the worst idea of our life. This is not for us. This should not be us whatsoever. Oh my god, we need to be able to get this. We need to get, and there was a real panic that we had for about 9 days. And then that was the greatest day ever. And I could imagine that, you're already, potentially 4 to 6 weeks before you even find out. And now you're really on a time crunch. Okay, well, what can I do now? Oh, it's not here. Well, there's these laws that are going around. So I can see where, yeah, Colorado for late term, that would be a huge increase because of people at the end of their rope and at a means of desperation.
yeah, and I think that the benefit of having national legislation is having national legislation would mean that in the circumstance that you just described, getting a medical getting a chemically induced abortion, so you can there's whether from my perspective, there's whether uh, uh, abortion medications could be over the counter or a simple prescription or something like that, but they would have to be provided um, in a very simple and very inexpensive way uh, to encourage. Well, it would do two things. One, it would encourage people to get earlier abortions when the child has not developed a nervous system, and uh, and it would limit that amount of panic because it's like, oh,
Well,
okay, well, this.
it's the exact same concept of Plan B. There's a lot of people that are able to use Plan B as a really effective contraception because, oh crap, well, I don't want to have an abortion. Well, we need to take this medication. We've got 48 hours. Let's do this. I mean, obviously, you should be doing it within 24 hours as soon as you possibly can. But there's enough knowledge about get this done, get it done quick because there's a window. And I think that could be kind of the conversation with, I believe the drug's mifepristone. That's the just the medication that you can be able to have it where it's a medication-induced abortion as opposed to a surgically induced one. And if that could be available at the same type of readiness that Plan B or the morning after pill was available, I think that would again take time for people to recognize as part of the oh, that's just a normal thing. But that was also the case with the sexual revolution in condoms and condom companies becoming wildly profitable out of nowhere, and it became a nothing thing to say, "Hey, are you having safe sex?"
Yeah, there's so and and again to to you know to to frame the religious argument that would be against it. So I talked about substance dualism. So the Catholic position is that the life, the vitality of the human being is created at the moment of conception. And um, and the science actually supports that because as soon as as soon as the as soon as the ovum is fertilized, uh, new DNA exists, and the DNA that exists only needs time and environment to become into a human
Yeah,
being.
the process starts as soon as it starts.
And the substance dualist is that the Catholic Church believes that the soul, the eternal part of a human, is also imparted at that exact same moment. So at the moment that a an ovum is fertilized, life begins. There's new DNA. There's a brand new creation, and that new creation has this immaterial substance of a soul. Uh, so, and that's why they're also opposed to IVF, in vitro fertilization, testing babies, because because often in that process, more eggs are fertilized and are utilized in order to create the pregnancy, and those other fertilized ovums are destroyed.
Well, and
So
isn't also the Catholic Church against traditional birth control because it's not that it prevents the egg from being fertilized, but it allows it to from being developed?
yeah, and that's there. So again, there and the Catholic Church also maintains that masturbation is a mortal sin. Um, so there's uh, and and this, I think this is important to recognize. It's that um, uh, the church is necessarily going to move much slower than society on social issues. Um, so, uh, so if you survey Catholics, and they've done this, if you survey Catholics and ask whether the Catholic, the average Catholic person believes that uh, believes in birth control, very, very few hold to the church's teaching on that. Um,
I'd imagine
Interestingly,
they'd probably feel the same about masturbating.
yeah, there's and there's uh, and this is where I think, I mentioned, having a personal theology, and but having a personal theology is very different than just saying, well, they're wrong on this one thing, and because they're wrong on this one thing, I'm not going to believe all the other things that are really, really good about this. And I think that that society has benefited from um, uh, from religion, and Christianity in particular, greatly. If you look at every country in the world that has been significantly influenced by Christianity in their history, they're pretty nice places to live. But if you look at every country in the world that has not been significantly influenced by Christians in their history, those places are terrible places to live. So, so uh, I mean, Africa is a good example. The entire continent of Africa, except for the very northern part, right? The Egyptian, where the Coptic Christians were. But everything from like Egypt, the south of Egypt down, the African continent has been a place of horror and misery for human beings. If you look at the Mid East, the uh, Israel is the only place where women can go to college. Israel is the only place where you can have a pride celebration in the Middle East. Israel, there's Israel. Israel allowed gay marriage long before the United States allowed gay marriage. But every country that's around Israel is women are miserable, and they're forced to wear things, and they have to. There's in Gaza, there's women are only allowed to leave their home with the permission of a man.
Hmm.
They can't even go outside unless they get the permission of either their husband or their father, or if their husband and they don't have a husband, the father's dead, a brother, a cousin, some male has to take ownership, control over every woman. So my whole point in that being is uh it's this gaslighting thing again. Um and I think that you know this issue that we're talking about with abortion, for me, it's a dignity issue. It's a it's a dignity for the human person that exists inside that womb. And I realize that we live in a world where things go wrong in a pregnancy all the time, and we live in a world where society creates pregnancies that, for whatever reason, are not wanted by the parents. So so uh, so I understand the church's position, but I'm also a political realist, and I would like to see a circumstance where we don't torture children anymore. And the way that you don't torture children is by requiring pain management for abortions once the child can we know that they can feel pain. But prior to that, um, make it really easy. And the only reason that I would say that you might even want to, keep those abortion medicines required by a prescription is so that you don't have someone who is 20 weeks pregnant going into a grocery store and buying abortion medications, because that child is still going to be there. Instead of being torn apart by forceps, they're going to be torn apart by muscle spasms, because that's what happens. It's
Yeah.
just it just creates cramps and muscle spasms, and those tear the child from the uterine lining, and then it's expelled. So it's the medication induces an abortion procedure that is a violent death for the child. It's always going to be a violent death for the child, but all death is violent. I mean, well, not all death, but almost all death that is not
All
a
death that
long,
is premature.
yeah. And they're so so you might want to have some control over that, but but I think that takes away the, oh well, and on the other side, for me, the issue is personal sovereignty. So, so a human being is sovereign over their body. Everything that's in their body, within their body, a human is sovereign over. So, the unfortunate reality for the child that lives inside a woman is they are subject to the sovereignty of their mother. And that, as long as that child is on the inside of that woman's body, I believe that woman has the right to do whatever she wants with her body, including an abortion. But I think it's reasonable for the state to regulate that, to reduce genuine suffering that we know takes place. And that would,
I,
and if they had that law, then that would mean in Texas, in Idaho, in Alabama, in Georgia, in Florida, every place would have to provide those access to safe and easy early abortions, and provide access to more expensive and more difficult later term abortions because they require pain management.
I uh I think having a place where we can come to a good agreement on a compromise is probably a really good spot to end tonight's episode, because we've been going at it for a couple hours now. And
Yeah.
and it's nice because, like, this is one of the things that I think people need to recognize is, you can hear somebody say, I want to see something changed, And without knowing what that trajectory of change looks like, you're always just going to think that you need to be defensive against the things that you don't know. And I think that being able to see where your heart comes from, like knowing what you feel about the sanctity of life, but still wanting to be able to allow people to um, still make decisions for themselves. There is a lot of compromise and there's a lot of nuance in that, and it's not as black and white as I think a lot of people really try to make it out to be. So I think that's, yeah, a really good place for us to kind of end a note on. Um, yeah, this is the second long conversation of the Supper Talk podcast. So if anybody has been paying attention now for our third episode, appreciate it. We're on Spotify and YouTube under Supper Talk Podcast. And if you can follow us, leave us a review, we would certainly appreciate it. We're going to keep trying to do this on a weekly basis and just talk about all the issues that nobody wants to have over dinner time. So I appreciate you listening to us. I'm Chris, and this is my dad, Steve. You guys have a great night.
Take care, y'all. See you later.